Hello, my name's David Waterton Anderson. This is the edit suite for Forest Edge Films, where we've been picking through some of the old cinefilm that's been collected and preserved by the Scottish Screen Archive in Glasgow. Thanks largely to their efforts, quite a lot of 20th century film that has been shot in Lanarkshire has been preserved. So let's take a trip down memory lane, shall we, and look at some of the industries that have gone, some of the places that have changed beyond all recognition, and let those memories flow as we look at Lanarkshire of old. For some, the changes which have epitomised 20th century Lanarkshire have been too swift, too harsh and too final. Modern Lanarkshire is a name synonymous with industry and endeavour. As one industry dies, another takes its place, yet the town which gave the county its name was denied the mineral wealth on which heavy industry feeds. It is a market town, and proud of it too. Lanark was, and still is, populated by generations of men and women steeped in the patient husbandry of rich farmlands out of which they grew. The rolling uplands are farmed intensively, but today the farmer's reward is determined more by politicians than by the quality of their produce. But it is not just the farmers who have learned to reap the harvest of the land. In the old days, the miners of the village of Lead Hills used to pan for gold in the streams all around. It's still there for the tourist to admire. Of course, it is the River Clyde which fertilised and nurtured Lanarkshire, bringing the rich glacial deposits which support the thriving horticultural industry of Scotland's, some say, Garden Valley, although in Scotland, of course, the straths were never valleys. Not content with its support for the rural fruit growers, the Clyde provided the power for Lanarkshire's 18th century cotton mills, the most famous of which was founded on its banks by David Dale here at New Lanark. The Victorians were both intrigued and scandalised by the social experiments of Dale's son-in-law, Robert Owen. But despite Owen's earlier regime of health and cleanliness, by the time this footage was shot in 1963, New Lanark's housing was substandard, and when the mill finally closed in 1968, demolition was a very real option. Today, the water wheels of industry are strictly for the tourist, but the Clyde itself is still an attraction, though perhaps less spectacularly so, since the force of its water was harnessed by the Bonington Power Station in 1928. But there are other attractions. This is the Lanarkshire Day Parade of 1937, a tradition dating back to the 12th century, when Lanark's town magistrates would ride out to check the borough boundary stones. What was once a simple administrative task has somehow, over the years, grown into a week-long festival, with the very first Lanarkshire Queen being crowned in 1893. For much of Lanarkshire, hand weaving was a major source of employment, but competition was fierce and prices notoriously low, particularly when demand from the army fell after victory at Waterloo. In Rhuddlan, the last hand loom weavers died out as the 20th century began, but there was still employment to be had in the quarries and coal pits that surrounded the town. The tramway system arrived in 1902, but perhaps the most interesting thing about this shot, taken in 1926 from the town hall, is the amount of farmland surrounding the town. Actually, this film was shot to celebrate Rhuddlan's octocentenary, 800 years as a borough. And to mark the occasion, the whole town turned out to witness the unveiling of the new Market Cross. Organising the weans, well, who else but the much loved and much photographed local character Archie Ewell. After the unveiling of the Market Cross came the grand historical pageant. No doubt it was a light-hearted affair, but I can't help feeling that some of these characters would have been more at home fighting for Ming the Merciless in a Flash Gordon matinee. No doubt Archie had a lead role in the pageant, perhaps Ming himself. See if you can spot him. Okay, I admit I didn't spot Archie either, but here he is again posing in front of the port gate, built in 1663 as the entrance to the parish kirkyard. Archie Ewell was known and loved by all. He was the sort of character that's sadly missed in today's more transient society. Archie died in 1929, but we have even more film of him, this time seen more fleetingly as he marches to the unveiling of Rhuddlan's War Memorial, designed by sculptor Robert Gray and unveiled on the 26th of October 1924. As the ceremony begins, you can't help thinking that the cameraman's choice of position is a little unfortunate for what was a sombre occasion, advertising as it does the film Slave of Desire, now showing at the Grand Central. And there was more embarrassment to come, as the unveiling itself proved just as problematical as the defeat of the Germans in the war itself. Still in 1924 and still in Ruglen, this is the Boys' Brigade demonstration and sports day at Ballochmill Park. Here the boys were put through their paces in front of their adoring parents, many of which would probably work at Colville's, whose factory and railway sidings border the site. Of course you could play football at Ballochmill Park, but Southcroft Park was the favoured location for this grudge match, featuring the all-conquering Regent Star team against the not all-conquering men in bowler hats. This piece of film is less than 40 years since the grudge match in Southcroft Park, but from the top of the town hall there's a very different view. Industry has filled the green spaces and the motorcar and motorbus have ended the tram's domination of Main Street. The age of personal transport had arrived. It was now far more feasible to live away from the workplace, and for much of Lanarkshire it was out with the old and in with the new. But for some places there were even greater plans.
In its day, Glasgow was both spacious and elegant, but with time it became more and more congested. Its population increased. Its boundaries were stretched. Glasgow was overcrowded. Even massive redevelopment wasn't enough. There was a need for rethinking, a new concept, the idea of completely new towns. Here on this unpromising moorland ridge, the planners set out to build a town for the future, a town that would draw people to it not only from Glasgow, but from all over Britain. Housing for 70,000 people, plus all the amenities a community requires. Schools, shops, hospitals, offices, workplaces, facilities for rest and recreation. A completely integrated new town. A budget of £70 million. Cumbernauld was new in more than one sense. Not just a new town, but a new concept of community living. It would not only look different, it would be different from other towns. Housing was arranged in cellular units clustered around the town centre. There were no streets in the old sense. Access and intercommunication was provided by a complex road system designed exclusively for motor cars. There were no intersections to impede the traffic flow, no grid to encourage the uncontrolled seepage of vehicles all through the town. There's been a village here for centuries. In redeveloping the old village and designing the new town, the architects have tried to build in character. Small, sturdy cottage homes that set their shoulders to the wind. Houses that grow out of the ground itself. Every 400 houses have a little corner shop, the local store. In this case, a converted farmhouse. Landscaping. Environment. It takes time for the raw earth scarred by the builders to heal into the green and pleasant landscape the architects envisaged. Space, sunlight, privacy, and the hilltop location were all factors which the designers exploited to the full. Patio houses were designed to give the family the maximum of privacy. But some have found the privacy just too much, especially people used to living cheek by jowl with neighbors. One of the dangers of modern city life is the loneliness in the crowd, and privacy can too easily become isolation. There are no traffic lights, no points duty police, no pedestrian crossings, no parking meters. Footpaths and roads are completely segregated. The ringway connects with massive interchanges on the hilltop. A dual carriageway links up with the town centre or the intercity motorways. Cumbernauld is a brilliantly logical solution to the conflict of cars and people. Cumbernauld is different, and because it's different, it's controversial. For some, it's just a jumble of spectacular concrete and uncompromising shapes. But for others, it's a last word in community architecture. In 1967, the Institute of American Architects voted Cumbernauld the world's best new town. In giving the Reynolds Memorial Award, they said, "Not only does Cumbernauld hold great significance for the architectural profession, but for the future development of community architecture in the Western world." It's a town that provokes strong reactions. It's impossible to feel indifferent about it. From all over the world, people come to criticize or to learn from what's being done here. Last year, there were 4,000 official visitors from 40 different countries. 2/3 of the town are still to be built. The second phase of the town centre is under construction now, and the planners are still discussing phases 3, 4, and 5. For the plans are always changing to meet new demands or to incorporate lessons learned from previous mistakes. Cumbernauld started as part of an effort to overcome someone else's housing problem, but it's developed into a challenging social experiment. It's a creation right from scratch of a self-sufficient town that's a centre for our region. It's tomorrow's town, built today, a pattern for the future.
And that pattern for the future was also apparent here in East Kilbride. In 1947, the population had woken one morning to discover that their sleepy little village was to be transformed into a futuristic new town for the modern age, whether they liked it or not. By the 1960s, East Kilbride was well on the way to its planned target of 70,000 people and had become an independent borough in its own right. East Kilbride was both the symbol and the symptom of Lanarkshire's purposeful drive into the new age of science-based industry. The National Engineering Laboratory, a government research centre serving industry throughout Britain, helped East Kilbride's claim to be the scientific capital of Scotland. All sorts of scientific principles, however unlikely, were tested in East Kilbride for modern industrial applications, like this airbed lathe, which worked on the hovercraft principle. It was research which led to new industries, exciting and exacting industries. Precision engineering which served to hoist man high above his native element. In Lanarkshire, the jet age had seemingly come to stay, but industrial success relied on ever-improving communications.
There is more motorway construction planned or in progress here than anywhere else in Scotland. The old red winding rural roads are being superseded by the 4- and 6-lane roads of the future, giving Lanarkshire the most sophisticated road and rail system in the country. From the industrialised northern reaches of the county, new motorways are driving south towards Carlisle and east to Edinburgh. They're bringing the vital port facilities of Glasgow and Grangemouth practically to Lanarkshire's doorstep. And a third motorway link to Stirling leads straight to the Highlands and beyond. Fast communications are essential to the speed of light industries of the future. As fast as light itself, modern electronics help to turn out millions of pills a week. Where Lanarkshire once was the bastion of the heavy forge, now the accent is on light precision engineering, delicately making the subtlest components for this electronic age. But the essentials still remain: the sharpness of eye, the quickness of hand. Human skill is still the greatest of all our resources, a skill that is basic but endlessly adaptable to the needs of this technological age. Tempus fugit, precious seconds, speeding swiftly, captured quickly, thrust them in a metal box, wheels and cogs to help imprison seconds that are known to fly. Speedy hands deceive the eye, nimble fingers help contain measurements of man's short reign. This is more than merely clever horological endeavour. Pivot pins and ratchet wheels, tiny screws and dustproof seals, gears and cogs and countless spindles, levers, rings and mainspring things. Tempus fugit, faster, faster, spinning hands but static faces. Hands and faces all intent and concentration to be spent on hoarding the elusive hour. Does it give a sense of power? Test and check for each split second. Only thus perfection reckoned. Final stages, end of line. Only question, what's the time?
Whatever the time, for much of Lanarkshire's workforce, it was too late. Much of the coal had been worked out, More modern, cleaner fuels were now taking over the market. In 1963, there were fewer than 15,000 miners left in the county, a mere quarter of their former number. True, the miners' working conditions had improved considerably, but there was no hiding the fact that this was an industry in decline. It had all seemed so improbable just a few decades earlier, when it was coal which turned the cogs and wheels of industry, coal which heated the homes of its workforce, and coal which lit the furnaces of Lanarkshire's steel plants. In September 1917, King George V came to Colville's in Motherwell in recognition of the strategic contribution that this plant was making to the war against the Hun. David Colville had initially established the Balliol Iron Works in 1871, but soon turned to making steel, responding to the enormous demands of a burgeoning shipbuilding industry in Glasgow. In 1936, Colville's and the Lanarkshire Steel Company merged, and by 1952, nearly 5,500 workers were employed between the two sites. The steel industry was of crucial national importance. It was a measure of a developed country's economic muscle, and as such was open to political interference. It was out of this interference that a new strip mill was born, Ravenscraig. The doubts of industry insiders were cast aside. Britain needed to maintain its rank in the world order. Britain needed a new strip mill, and the government gave Colville's £50 million to persuade them to build it.
Thus started 3 years of work for men and machines to dig and build, to create the new strip mills, the biggest single engineering development ever undertaken in Scotland. At Ravenscraig, over a square mile of site clearance was necessary to provide for buildings, roads and railway sidings. The water table in some areas was no great depth beneath the surface, and effective sealing against water ingress had to be ensured. Inspection by diver and submarine television cameras was necessary to prove the water sealing of the liners. The 2 new furnaces will be equipped for high top pressure blowing. Each furnace will have 3 hot blast stoves, which will be capable of heating the blast air to over 1,000 degrees centigrade. The extension of the original coke oven line will bring a total of 210 ovens into operation at Ravenscraig. The gases given off during the coking process will not go up in smoke. The cleaned coke oven gas is used in the plant as a fuel gas, and naphthalene, crude benzol, ammonia and tars are derived for use in industry and agriculture. The strip mill will have a 4-high reversing roughing mill, a 6-stand 4-high finishing mill, and 430 feet of run-out table. In various parts of Britain, as far apart as Sheffield, Middlesbrough, London, Stafford, Norwich and Glasgow, manufacture of the plant is now nearing completion. From paper drawing to wood pattern. From wood pattern to steel casting, components large and small, their state of readiness is carefully timed. Installation at site cannot take place until protection from the weather is assured. Large units are test assembled before starting their journey to site. While some units go conveniently in the back of a lorry, others cause headaches on the highway. The movement of the larger pieces needs planning with police and local authorities. Routes suitable for long loads and heavy loads are searched out, and the height of all overhead bridges carefully checked for clearance. Many loads will move at off-peak traffic hours, and drivers may have to camp out with their loads for several nights. Even with all this planning, as the loads get nearer to site, the congestion becomes more difficult to avoid, especially if you're carrying the heaviest and biggest girder for an overhead crane ever manufactured in Europe. 94 tons, 124 feet long, 12 feet high, and 11 feet broad. By road, by rail, and even by sea. This mill housing sailed from Liverpool. It's 144 tons, and there's another just like it. Miles of new railway lines were laid to move raw material and finished product. One coil of strip steel may weigh 26.5 tons. Across the Calder will travel slag from the furnaces, and 1,000 tons at a time, railway wagons will carry hot rolled coils the 9 miles from Ravenscraig to Gartcosh. At Gartcosh, the coils must be annealed after cold rolling. These annealing furnaces are constructed with an inner lining of stainless steel and provide an oxygen-free atmosphere for the process. They will consume 20 million cubic feet of town gas per week to raise the inner temperature to 680 degrees centigrade. This job has needed plumbers and joiners, electricians and welders, civil engineers, surveyors, soil testers, crane men, roadmen, railmen and T-men. But for all there were so many, such is the vastness of this place, that they were lost against the background of the job. And that's it, finished. 3 years, 165 days, and 66 million pounds, give or take a few thousand, later. It's ready now, ready to go. The labourers, the steel men, the concrete makers, and the 101 others, it's over for them. But for Bobby, and Dick, and Jimmy, and Mac, for the new men, it's just beginning.
900. Right furnace, right Bobby, push the next bar. 34, 650. Right furnace, right Bobby, push the next bar. 34, 650.
Steel by the ton, steel by the mile.
They could have added losses by the million, for Ravenscraig opened in 1963 at a time of depleting mineral reserves and a falling market. In 1977, its workforce peaked at 13,500, but on the 27th of June 1992, the Ravenscraig plant was closed. The unemployment black spot the government had sought to avoid some 30 years earlier had merely been delayed. The repercussions of the closure were felt county-wide, for no industry exists in isolation. This is a clay mine, working the rich fire clay seams stretching from Glenboig in the west, bending down in a deep curve until they rise again in the Bonnybridge area. The Glenboig Union Fire Clay Company had been formed in 1882 and at one time grew to be the largest brickworks in the world. The fire bricks produced from this mine would have found a huge market, lining the furnaces of the iron and steel industries. Fire bricks were needed everywhere, for glass making, gasworks and electricity generation, not to mention the more familiar domestic use. When this film was shot, demand was strong, but working down the mines was never easy and conditions were abysmal. Perhaps in this case, we should also consider the men behind the camera, who, unusually, film themselves loading equipment back into their van. They are right to look pleased with themselves, for filming in the dark, damp and cramped mine shafts was no easy matter. As for the pit ponies, well, many of them knew nothing other than life underground, but sympathy for them must be tempered by the fact that they had taken over jobs previously carried out by children. For much of the 20th century, commuting to work was not a realistic option, and housing was provided close to site by the employer. Thus it was that villagers had a real sense of community, of belonging and togetherness. The horrendous losses of the Great War could not break this spirit, and when the 1st Battalion Lanarkshire Volunteer Regiment marched through Coatbridge in 1917, it was to the cheers and encouragement of almost the entire population, still confident that victory would somehow emerge from the slaughter in the quagmire of Flanders Field. If war's end was not enough cause for celebration, less than a year later, the people of Coatbridge gathered once again, this time to celebrate the opening of Drumpellier Moss Park, gifted to Coatbridge by Mr. W.R. Carrick Buchanan on the 13th of September 1919. For the official ceremony, Councillor Kellogg presented Mrs. Buchanan with a pair of golden scissors with which she could cut the tartan ribbon and declare the park open to all. The fun and games could begin. The donation of parks was a fairly common practice among wealthy industrialists of the time, and it's true to say that most are appreciated just as much today as on the day they were opened. The more cynical of us might point to the likes of Overtoun Park in Rugden, donated to the town in 1908 by James White, who is Lord Overtoun, and regard it as a scant compensation for the pollution caused by his chemical works. But of course none of this concerned the folk of Coatbridge, who had more immediate problems to solve. The Memorial Park in Lark Hall was built to honour Robert Smillie, founding member of the Scottish Labour Party. Robert Smillie lived for most of his life here in Lark Hall at number 29 Miller Street, and had been the MP for Morpeth in Northumberland between 1923 and 1929. He died at Lark Hall on the 16th of February 1940. The community spirit of most towns and villages was reflected in the success of the Cooperative Society. This is Wishaw in 1909, and it's Gala Day, a day out for the weans who were gathered together at the Co-op premises in Russell Street and paraded down Hill Street to the station. Organised outings such as this were common in the early 1900s, with East Kilbride, promoted as a health resort, though too quiet for some, being a popular destination. There was even a fresh air fortnight, organised for Glasgow's poor children at Nerston School. There may still be some fresh air in East Kilbride, but the new town centre is hardly likely to attract tourists. You could be forgiven for thinking that the whole development had been sponsored by the corporate movie moguls of America. In the rush to rehouse those from the tenement slums of Glasgow, some serious mistakes had been made, and not just in East Kilbride and Commonwealth. In 1963, the nearly completed council offices in Hamilton were regarded with awe. Futuristic, Hamilton's own Empire State Building, some said. The popularity of such high-rise concrete monoliths has waned somewhat over recent years and after even more recent tragic events. The South Lanarkshire Council offices in Hamilton preside over a county now reorganised, but still one which has grown rapidly since the Industrial Revolution and the discovery of coal and other mineral wealth. In 1801, the population of Lanarkshire was just 148,000. By 1901, it had risen tenfold, as the county, founded on agriculture and weaving, became an industrial powerhouse, consuming labour from far and wide. Hamilton, today, is perhaps an uneasy mix of old and new. Much has been lost, most notably the palace of the Dukes of Hamilton, sacrificed in the name of coal and the consequent subsidence. Still, thanks to Il Magnifico, otherwise known as Duke Alexander, the Hamilton mausoleum remains, a testimony to his own self-esteem and worthiness, a far cry from the tiny two-room miners' cottages in Quarter, the site of the Hamiltons' first pit. Some of Hamilton's grand buildings, including the town hall, have been demolished to make way for modern shopping facilities. Today's shoppers here in Quarry Street have forgotten, if they ever knew, that the air here was once thick with the noise and smell of cattle, penned in and ready for market. So much has changed for Lanarkshire, and so quickly, as the county presses forward into the 21st century. Nothing can stand in the path of progress. This was Bothwell Hall, once a hard-working mining village, serving the Hamilton Palace Colliery. It was the sort of place where children could play safely in the street, and perhaps not so safely, off it. It was a real community in every sense of the word. Today, it is gone. Not a trace remains. The only reference to Bothwell Hall's existence is the name of the pavilion in Strathclyde Country Park, the leisure development which has engulfed it. The story of Bothwell Hall was one of ordinary people living ordinary lives, but for me, this film, shot by local man Joe Griffiths between 1962 and 1965, is priceless. This is Bothwell Hall long gone, but not forgotten. It's been a delightful pleasure for me to present this video to you. I do hope you've enjoyed watching. Many thanks and Godspeed.